and welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun-jung Cho. The leaders of South Korea, Japan, and China held their first trilateral summit in more than 4 years, agreeing to boost economic cooperation and people-to-people exchanges. North Korea conducted a series of provocations immediately after the meeting. Today, we discuss geopolitics and security in Northeast Asia.
한반도의 평화와 안정을 유지하는 것이 삼국 공동의 이익이자 책임임을 재확인하였습니다.
北朝鮮の非核化と日中韓3カ国の共通利益である点を改めて確認しました。
我们也希望相关方保持克制，防止事态进一步复杂化。
In the studio with me, Ambassador James Jeffrey, chair of the Middle East program at the Wilson Center. Ambassador Jeffrey was the special representative for Syria engagement and the special envoy for a global coalition to defeat ISIS. Ambassador Jeffrey also served as the deputy national security advisor during the George W. Bush administration. He was also the U.S. ambassador to Iraq, Turkey, and to Albania. Also joining us, Dr. Victor Cha, Korea Chair and Senior Vice President for Asia at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He is the Distinguished University Professor and Professor of Government at Georgetown University. Dr. Cha was the Director for Asian Affairs at the National Security Council, and he was also the Deputy Head of the U.S. delegation at the Six-Party Talks. Dr. Cha is currently a contributor to MSNBC and NBC News. Dr. Cha's latest report is Breaking Bad, South Korea's Nuclear Option. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, Ambassador Jeffrey, the leaders of South Korea, Japan, and China revived the framework for cooperation, but didn't agree on security issues, and they failed to put in the joint declaration the goal of denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, in contrast to what happened in 2019. Is this going backwards from 2019?
Certainly it is, and of course, thank you for having me on. It is troubling because China has taken a somewhat different position on North Korean nuclearization, including recently in a UN Security Council vote, than, for example, Russia. And we didn't see this in this latest round. China has great interest in not seeing nuclear proliferation anywhere, but particularly in East Asia. So I was a bit surprised, and it's not a good sign.
Dr. Cha, Chinese Premier Li Chang attended and not President Xi Jinping. And analysts say that China has limited the scope of cooperation with South Korea and Japan. And the joint declaration excludes security issues like North Korea, Taiwan, and Chinese aggression in Asia. Do you think China's self-imposed limits of cooperation is reflected in the joint declaration?
I think the joint declaration was about what I expected to come out of it. With regard to the asymmetry in the leadership, this has always been a problem with this trilateral meeting. The Koreans and the Japanese could insist that it should be Xi Jinping, but then the meetings wouldn't happen. And at least from a Korean perspective, since they host the secretariat for the trilateral dialogue, that it wouldn't happen. So I think for this reason, it's ended up being asymmetric like this. I expected that it would focus on a lot of the sort of easier issues like people-to-people exchanges and the other things they mentioned. I think there was even some mention of a trilateral FTA, accelerating those talks. I don't expect those will reach any conclusion anytime soon. It's very hard to get an FTA with Japan or with China. But the absence of security issues, as Ambassador Jeffrey said, is disappointing, and it's reflective more of the whether it's the inability, the incapacity, or the outright opposition by China to this, because certainly I'm sure the Japanese and the South Koreans would have loved to see more talk about security in the trilateral statement.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Cha, China's emphasis on mutual respect for core interests is asking South Korea and Japan to stay out of the Taiwan issue. China also asking to stabilize the industrial supply chain is asking South Korea and Japan to distance themselves from the US-led semiconductor alliance. So what do you make of this, that China is asking South Korea and Japan all these things and not cooperating on the North Korea problem?
Well, it certainly is asymmetrical, of course. I mean, I think that, again, the main interest I think that both Korea and Japan had in this was restarting the dialogue, because it had been suspended for so long, in part because of COVID, but in part because of difficulties with China. I think we're going to see a period in which Korea and Japan actually are re-engaging with China on some of the issues that you mentioned, but I don't think it'll be the way the Chinese want. So, like you said, the Chinese want respect for core interests, which means don't talk about Taiwan, don't talk about South China Sea, don't talk about Hong Kong. But my understanding is, at least when the Koreans re-engage, they're going to reserve the right to talk about those sorts of issues. And when it comes to supply chains and industrial cooperation, I think there will be a re-engagement on the broader title of supply chains, but it's not coordinating supply chains. It's more, I think what the Koreans and the Japanese want from the Chinese is they want to know if the Chinese are going to cut something off, some critical mineral or something like that. They want early warning for that so that they can be ready to adjust. So I think the Chinese have laid out some of the things they want, and there will be conversations on that, but it won't be on the terms that the Chinese want.
Mm-hmm. Ambassador Jeffrey, the three leaders agreed to pursue trilateral free trade agreement, as Dr. Cha noted, and to supply chain cooperation as well. Wouldn't this heavy focus on economic cooperation among the three countries undermine U.S. interest and also weaken the alignment of U.S., South Korea, and Japan against China?
I don't think so, because I think, first of all, here in Washington, we try very hard to separate our continued very important trade relations with China from strategic issues where we try to de-risk, as the administration calls it, relations in key areas such as electric vehicles and, as Dr. Cha mentioned, high-tech electronics, semiconductors, and that kind of thing. So I think that we can't expect the Japanese, and particularly the Koreans, with their dependency on trade with China, to be otherwise. So I don't see this as a particularly serious step. It simply is the natural way countries deal with each other.
But wouldn't South Korea feel the pressure, given current U.S. efforts to shore up support among allies against Chinese economic aggression? Wouldn't South Korea feel that pressure coming from the United States? And of course, the South Korean presidential office is currently thinking hard about these issues as well.
So as Victor and I know from having been in the White House National Security Council, we put pressure on every country on every issue. That's in our DNA. But the question those countries have learned to ask is how much pressure, how important. Across the board, the South Korean government is doing so many things to strengthen global collective security, be it in Ukraine, in its actions in support of the American positions in the Middle East, and of course, with Japan and with the United States. It's hard for me to imagine that we're going to make a big fuss about this.
North Korea attempted to launch military reconnaissance satellite, and that failed in flight. And North Korea warned just before the trilateral summit that it's going to launch the satellite. Was this North Korea's way of expressing its dissatisfaction with China, or do you think China had prior knowledge or approval about this event?
I think North Korea has a long history of doing things that surprise even its supposed friends in Beijing and in Moscow. And I don't think this was a happy event from the standpoint, if I were the Chinese, I wouldn't have been happy with it happening. So it did have a kind of overshadowing effect. But the most important thing to remember is This has military significance in and of itself. Also, the military missile technology that gets you to put satellites into space can help you further develop missiles like the Hwasong 17. So this is troubling apart from its time relationship with the Trilateral Summit.
Dr. Cha, I talked to some missile experts, and some of them think that the new engine system, the kerosene liquefied oxygen, could not have been possible without the help of Russia. Do you think the Russian transfer of technology is much more sophisticated than originally expected?
So I'm quite worried about that. I know historically the Soviet Union has not been as willing to lend technology directly to North Korea. North Korea has usually gotten that through third parties and reverse engineered it. That's why many engines are Soviet origin, but they weren't necessarily gotten directly from the Soviet Union. But we're in a completely different situation now where North Korea's supply of munitions are critical to Putin's war in Ukraine. And so DNI Avril Haines said the other day as a part of the annual threat assessment, there are concerns that Russia is dropping long-held non-proliferation norms when it's dealing with North Korea. So there were some press reports that a whole bunch of Russian scientists were in North Korea prior to this failed satellite launch. I have a lot of concerns that Russia may be transferring things that go beyond food and fuel in return for these munitions. Not necessarily because they want to, but it's because what the North Koreans are demanding. Because for the first time in the history of this relationship, the North Koreans have something that the Russians really need, that Putin needs basically for his survival if he's going to try to win this war. If he loses this war in Ukraine, he's done. So he really needs this, and he may be willing to provide that sort of technology, which is very concerning, whether it's what you described, whether it's ICBM countermeasure technology, advanced telemetry, nuclear submarine technology. These things are very worrying.
What about miniaturization of warheads?
Sure, miniaturization. I mean, I think there was an IC assessment, a US IC assessment a few years ago that they have been able to miniaturize, but certainly anything along those lines. These are all things that the Chinese have usually not been willing to give this stuff to North Korea, and the Soviets also, but we're in a completely different world right now, and it's very concerning.
Ambassador Jeffrey, Dr. Cha just emphasized how North Korea has something that Putin really needs at this point, but isn't there an expiration date in this cooperation? When the war ends, wouldn't the usefulness of North Korea diminish to Russia?
You're absolutely right, Eun-jung. But the real question is, how will the war in Ukraine end? We're not here to talk about Europe, but it does overshadow, as we just heard, Russia's decisions with North Korea. If the war ends on something like the way that Korea ended in 1953, then, just as we did see with the Soviet Union, Russia will move away from confrontation and try to rebuild relationships. And I suspect that they will drop at least some of their cooperation with North Korea like a hot stone. At least that's my hope, but we're not there yet.
Dr. Cha, do you think the recurring calls for nuclear armament in South Korea will affect the hardening fault lines between US, South Korea, Japan, and North Korea, China, and Russia? Your latest report, Breaking Bad, South Korea's nuclear option, has drawn keen interest. Do you think the general public's call for nuclear drive is becoming an obstacle between cooperation between Washington and Seoul?
Right now, I don't think it has. I mean, I think the public's call for nuclear weapons, whatever 60 to 75% of South Koreans poll positively on this, has driven policy in the sense that the creation of the Washington Declaration, the Nuclear Consultative Group, the NCG, the port calls by the USS Kentucky and other things have been in part in response to this growing concern in South Korea about the credibility of extended deterrence, the desire for a nuclear capability. But as you mentioned in our report, what we find is that while the public's view might be like that, the strategic elites, meaning current and former government officials, business elites, academics, experts, they're really on the other side of the fence on this. Actually, the majority of them are not positive on the idea, at least for now, positive on the idea of going nuclear. So I think when Americans and Japanese hear that this is sort of the view of strategic elites, which all the literature says that that's the most important group in terms of how a country thinks about its national security and foreign policy. National security and foreign policy usually is not populist-based. It is based on sort of a careful conversation among strategic elites and policymakers. At least in that space right now, that's not where Korea is, and I would consider that to be comforting news both to Americans and Japanese.
You touched upon my follow-up question a little bit. You said the foreign policy is not populist-based, and your recent survey showed that 34% of the strategic elites are for the nuclear drive, whereas 70% of the general public want the nuclear drive in South Korea. But this specific issue of wanting to get nuclear weapons, I think it goes beyond just being any other foreign policy issue. The South Korean general public shows keen interest in this issue. Wouldn't this affect the policymakers' decisions?
Well, it certainly could. If you had a leader that was populist and that their views were entirely determined by the political winds, it could. Leadership does matter in that sense, and public opinion certainly does matter. I don't think that's what we have in South Korea today. I think there's a leader in South Korea today who has very strong opinions about the alliance, about improving relations with Japan, about being very skeptical of China, about supporting Ukraine, both with direct humanitarian assistance and indirectly. And it doesn't matter how he seems to do in elections, he feels very strongly about it. So it could certainly happen in other cases, but so far in this case, I don't think it will. I will say that if strategic elite opinion were to change in South Korea, then things could shift very dramatically, because the elites would then move into a place where the majority of the public already is, right? 70% of the public already is, and then policy could shift very dramatically in that sense. But I don't think that's where we are now.
But even though the president is not a populist president, the South Korean officials can use the general public opinion in their policy and negotiation and diplomacy with Washington. We saw that in the lead up to the Washington Declaration.
Yes, that's right. And I think that's why the Biden administration, Secretary Austin, others have been working very hard to continue to reassure, bolster extended deterrence, missile defense exercising, reading Korean counterparts into how we do nuclear decision-making and nuclear planning, these sorts of things. So I think that is continuing to go forward. But unless there's some sort of external shock of some sort, I really don't see strategic elite opinion changing. It's a huge, Ambassador Jeffrey knows better than any, it's a huge decision for a country to make to decide to go nuclear, especially an allied country.
Ambassador Jeffrey, in Dr. Cha's report, it says that South Korean elite confidence on security guarantee is not a present to Washington, but it must be earned. How is it possible for Koreans to have confidence over U.S. nuclear umbrella in the pre-event, in the pre-nuclear attack situation?
That's a very good question, but that question has been posed because it's the core question of global collective security since the end of World War II, not just in Korea, but in Europe and elsewhere. And in the end, as Dr. Cha said, there is a strong bias to stay with collective security because it works. In the shadow of everything we're talking about today is the very powerful diplomatic and military response of the U.S., Australia, Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, India, and other countries to the more threatening environment in East Asia. That's how collective security works. What Dr. Cha also said in his report is it looks like the United States will not provide that nuclear guarantee. Then I think 50% of those elites who said they were against going nuclear would change their mind. I don't think we'll get to that. The Koreans pressed the U.S., as we talked about in the Washington Declaration, and they got a new organ, what's called the Nuclear Consultative Group, to talk about extended deterrence, and they also got a visit by a nuclear-armed submarine. And I think that Washington knows which buttons to push to reassure, we hope, the population, but certainly the elites, and most importantly, the leadership of South Korea, and I think it's working.
Ambassador Jeffrey, you said we're not going to get there where the elites will have insecurity about U.S.'s security guarantee, but some experts that I talk to say that Washington Declaration is only buying time, and the next step would be the redeployment of U.S. tactical nuclear weapons to South Korea. And recently, Republican Senator Roger Wicker said that we need to redeploy nuclear weapons to South Korea because there's no diplomatic solution to North Korea's nuclear and missile program. Republican Senator Jim Risch also said that to bolster extended deterrence. Is this a reflection of the Republican thinking that the current state of extended deterrence is not enough to guarantee security to the allies?
I don't think so. I think that this is the Republicans in this instance, not in all instances, but in this one, simply wanting to pick at the Democratic successful policy. They don't really want to take a step as dramatic as that. We're at a time of very delicate nuclear policy globally, with Iran on the verge of a nuclear weapon potentially, and of course Russia constantly threatening escalation to the nuclear level in Ukraine. A major step like redeploying tactical systems to South Korea. We only have them in Europe, nowhere else in the world. That would be dramatic. It's not necessary at this point. And frankly, it undercuts, in some ways, the extended deterrence that we're offering to South Korea, because we're saying we'll use nukes in Korea rather than engage the homeland. To really promote collective security, we have to say our homeland is also threatened, along with your homeland.
So these comments that we heard from some of the senators, is this a marginalized view, or do you think that's sort of what the Republicans think?
The party that is out of power in Washington always presents an alternative foreign policy that finds alternatives to every single thing the administration is doing, because that's the nature of politics. Some things they believe in very strongly. For example, they're very unhappy about Iran and our policies towards Iran. They want a much stricter policy towards Iran. But on other issues, and they want probably a less aggressive policy towards Russia on Ukraine. They want that war to end. Those are the only two in support of Israel. Those are the three issues that are very important to the Republicans. The rest of these things are simply checking boxes. Yes, the administration has a successful policy with Korea and with Japan against China. Let's find something wrong with it, but it's not really serious.
Dr. Cha, the survey results show a degree of partisanship, that 68% of respondents who say they support nuclear armament identify themselves as conservatives, 22% as moderates, and 10% as progressives. But isn't there a contradiction there where the South Korean progressive camp are lenient in denuclearizing North Korea? They say that South Korea shouldn't push North Korea too hard on denuclearization.
So I mean, in terms of those numbers, it was surprising to us from the survey that there were self-identified progressives that were in favor of nuclearization, because that's generally not what we hear from progressives in South Korea. They're not in favor of civil nuclear energy. They're not in favor of nuclear weapons. And as you said, they don't want to push too hard. They prioritize inter-Korean reconciliation over sort of weapons denuclearization. So that was a little bit surprising. I think what was important, though, was of the group that was not in favor of going nuclear. So in total, 66% who are not positive on the statement South Korea should have a nuclear capability. That was very bipartisan or nonpartisan. In other words, roughly a third said they were conservative, a third said they were in the middle, and a third said they were progressive. So the message of that is there's broad-based support for staying non-nuclear, while there tends to be much more conservative, heavy support for going nuclear.
Well, that's all the time we have for this week. Dr. Cha, Ambassador Jeffrey, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. We'll be back here next week with U.S. experts to discuss the two Koreas and the region right here from Washington.